A study by Duke-NUS Medical School reveals that there were up to 40 cases of heat-related illnesses each year from 2008 to 2019, and most incidents happened around December, which coincided with the lead-up of local marathons. Those affected were mainly adults aged 18 to 64 who frequently exercise outdoors. Sabrina Ong with more.
Before a long run, Ture will stretch and do some warm-ups. The 27-year-old exercises at least once a month outdoors. About a decade ago, a routine run under the hot sun landed him in the hospital.
I was already in a slightly dehydrated state, but I didn't drink enough water. I was about 3 to 4 kilometers into the run. I didn't feel quite comfortable. It felt very tiring somehow. But I decided to just push on, and the next thing I knew, I ended up in the hospital.
He was hospitalized for a week. Such heat stroke injuries are not unique. Duke-NUS Medical School gathered data from Singapore General Hospital's emergency department for its study. It found that heat-related illnesses, like heat stroke or exhaustion, happen mostly late in the year. The medical school says it's likely linked to preparations for mass exercise events like marathons. The study showed that the mortality rate for heat-related illnesses is very low. But it doesn't mean such potential injuries should be ignored.
Your tissues, your organs can be damaged. And severe cases, you have multiple organ failure. And we hope we don't go into the extreme end, which is death.
Associate Professor Lee expects cases of heat-related illnesses to increase along with Singapore's rising temperatures. Last year was the country's fourth hottest year on record. Temperatures hit a sweltering 37 degrees Celsius in May. Associate Professor Lee says heat not only affects a person's health, but can also impact work productivity and mental well-being. The consequences can be severe for those training for sports competitions, as some athletes may push beyond their limits.
If you're feeling dizzy, nauseous, lightheadedness, take a rest, instead of pushing yourself to the limits. Then, of course, how do you manage it? And in training for a marathon, or even any other races, it's good to run with a buddy so that when you collapse, there's someone there.
Duke-NUS Medical School and Sports Singapore are also studying how heat can impact other sporting activities.
With temperatures expected to rise 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century in Singapore, how are heat-related injuries being treated, and are we prepared to tackle the rising heat?
Well, for more, we are joined by Professor Marcus Ong from Duke-NUS Medical School and Singapore General Hospital. Good evening, Professor Ong. It's good to see you. And I should mention that seated next to you is Larry.
Yes, this is Larry here.
We'll explain why Larry is here tonight. But first of all, let's talk about those study findings. They suggest that heat injury treatments for the young and are most common on a Sunday and also in the month of December. Is there a correlation?
Yes, this was one of the first studies that actually has been done in a long time in Singapore, outside of the military context, that is related to heat injuries. And what is interesting is that in contrast to other countries where the victims of heat injuries are typically the very old and vulnerable, in Singapore we found that it's mainly the young people and those having outdoor exposure. The second thing that was interesting from the data is that it mainly occurs on weekends and especially in December. And when we dug into that, we realized that it's actually related to outdoor activities and mass events like marathons or even mass gatherings. And so this is actually the vulnerable population in Singapore.
Professor, given that this particular demographic in this particular section of activity is the most vulnerable, that heat, that suit right there that is used to treat heat-related injuries, how can that actually help?
Right, the carbon cool system was developed at Singapore General Hospital and Duke-NUS. And the core of the technology is a carbon graphite material that is 20 times better than ice at conducting temperature. And so what you do is basically you put this in the freezer when it's frozen. We actually load it into a Velcro system that can mix and match and fit any body type. So for example, here you can cover the chest, abdomen, and typically the thighs. And I actually invented this originally to treat cardiac arrest victims in order to protect the brain from injury. But today, it's been licensed out to a startup company, and the biggest application is actually for heat stroke and sports-related injuries. And it's being used frontline in the Singapore Armed Forces.
Clarify this for me, because you mentioned managing brain injury. Essentially, when you cool something down, the degree and the spread of damage is controlled. But is that why we are doing this?
Exactly. So I always use the analogy of your Wagyu meat that is cooking on the hot stone, right? The longer the meat stays on the stone, it goes from rare to medium to well done. And what you really need when the body is cooking under high temperatures is to remove the body or the organs from that heat exposure. And this actually reduces the amount of damage to the tissues. And that's what the carbon cool system does. Because we can apply it actually pre-hospital, even before the ambulance arrives or before you arrive at the hospital.
So it's a very important piece of equipment there, Professor Ong. But speaking of rising temperatures and the body cooking from within, I mean, we're facing rising temperatures because of climate change. The National Climate Change Study Project, just 3 weeks ago, we saw that they have these expectations of a rise of about 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Is there going to be an epidemic of sorts of heat-related illnesses due to that, if we don't do something to mitigate?
We just had a climate and health seminar this morning in Duke-NUS, and the projections are, pretty serious stuff for us to contemplate. We are looking at basically a 0.5 to 5 degree increase in our median temperatures by the end of the century. And that means that climate change is a reality that we will have to deal with, and we will have to learn how to adapt to as a society. And I think from the researchers' perspective, there are 4 things that needs to be done. So number 1, we need more clinical studies to actually understand how this is impacting our population, especially our vulnerable. And we need collaboration between the hospitals and various scientists to work together. The second is that we need to actually use our climate models and relate that to health data and health outcomes. And so we can actually guide policy and do better preparation and treatments. Number 3, we need more innovative treatments and diagnostics. Just like the carbon cool system, we need to find better ways to measure core temperature, for example, non-invasively, and come up with a better way to actually convey our messaging to the public such that they know what to do in a particular situation. And finally, we need to recognize, number 4, that this is a global problem, and we need to work with our international partners, especially low middle income countries which are facing this particularly in Asia, and that there's a lot of room for sharing of best practices and helping one another.
Very quickly, Professor Ong, is this not common sense? As the lady mentioned just now, hot, stay away, use common sense.
Exactly. So I would give the layperson 3 kind of advice. So number 1, think about climate, think about clothing, think about condition. So climate is something that we can't change, but we can adapt to. For example, what is the best time to exercise? Should you do it indoor or outdoor? Can you change your routine and adapt to it? Number 2, clothing. The main method of heat loss in our environment is actually evaporation. So wear clothes that will allow you to evaporate. I remember doing medical cover for marathons and seeing guys running in the onesie suit, dressed up as superheroes and all that. It looks very cute, but I don't think it's a very good idea. And number 3, condition. So understand your own condition. Have you been unwell? Are you on medication that may affect you? Have you been properly prepared and acclimatized and conditioned for the kind of exercise or activity that you want to do? And lastly, I think early recognition is important.
Yeah.
So if you're not well, you feel nauseous, giddy, you fainted, you have cramps, know when to stop. And from the organizer's point of view, have you got your risk mitigation, risk planning? Do you have trained staff that know how to recognize heat injuries and start treatment early?
Well, I can say without a doubt that Larry is the coolest one among us sitting here in this studio. Thank you so much, Professor Ong, for coming to the studios and talking to us about this important topic. Professor Marcus Ong there from Duke-NUS and Singapore General Hospital. Thank you.
Thank you.